Hello and welcome to today's daily response video from People Make It Work. I'm Zara, creative producer, and today I'm joined by our associate, Ellen O'Hara. Hi, Ellen.
Hi there. Hi, Zara.
Thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I'd be really interested to dive in and find out a little bit more about how you work with People Make It Work, and also what is so important to you about supporting organisations and people to change and develop.
Okay, great. So I'm Ellen, and I'm a freelance enterprise coach and consultant. So that means my work with People Make It Work is usually centred around supporting organisations to build and test and launch like new products or services that have earned income potential. So I might be working on a whole earned income strategy, or just looking at ways that an organisation or a team can take a slightly more entrepreneurial approach to what they do. And I think what really drives me about that is, I guess I'm most passionate about helping organisations discover what their audiences and communities really value about what they do. So it's not about discovering where the kind of bottom line opportunities are first and foremost. It's really about understanding value and how an organisation creates value, through action and through doing things and through testing ideas, so that they can ultimately develop a more sustainable business model and make more impact for more people. And then through that process, hopefully discover what their own brand of entrepreneurship is, that's really values based and really fits with how they operate as an organisation.
Brilliant. Could you, with that entrepreneurial knowledge and around testing new ideas, could you provide some insights, looking at the current moment that we're in? Could you talk us through some insights that have come up for you, and then perhaps some actions or some considerations that we could take on board?
Sure. Yeah, I think what I've been noticing, certainly in the last week or so, with the companies that I work with, excuse me, and the projects that I work on, and I chair a small theatre company too, is that we're starting slowly to move out of that space of emergency planning and stabilisation and starting to do some futures thinking. And so this feels like a really great time to experiment with ideas. There may be brand new ideas. So I'm going to talk a little bit about experiments and how to run experiments, how to design a good experiment. But I think it's important to think about why experimentation is really useful now. I think it's always a really useful way to work, but it's particularly useful when we're in high uncertainty, because there's lots of new things for us to discover, lots of things changing every day. So rather than invest in a brand new program that we might have a really good hunch about, if we can run a series of experiments that help us to build a picture as we go, it's a lower cost, lower risk way of testing our ideas, and it just feels like a really useful approach right now. So it's a bit more discovery driven, and it's a really good way to practice some kind of entrepreneurial bias to action ways of doing things, because it's an approach that's about kind of small steps helping us to build a bigger picture.
I really like that perception of kind of shifting it into more of a discovery space and what that can allow for.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's about learning. So experiments are about learning. And I think it helps us move away from black and white success and failure and more into a space where we're exploring and generating insights, because none of us are going to have the right answer about what to do next. But we can be building our understanding, and we can be building our capability to find out. So I think that's why these kind of things are useful. So I've probably got 4 things to consider in thinking about experiments. So if I just run through each of those. The first thing is being really clear about what you're testing. And I'll say a bit more about each of them. But the first one is clarity about what you're testing. The second one is deciding which order to test things in. The third thing is deciding how you're going to test. So which kind of experiment you might use. And the fourth thing is deciding how best to evaluate the results, what kind of metrics you might use around that. So if I go through them one by one, keep me on timer. So the most important thing is to be really clear about what you're testing. So have real clarity about, and it might be a big focus question, such as, what does our audience need from us right now? Or it might be a series of assumptions that we're making about our changing audience needs, or whether they prefer digital or analog right now, whether they want to have interactive experiences versus more passive experiences, could be things like that. So I guess the first action is to just list all of those assumptions, list all of those questions. And I would usually suggest listing them under kind of 3 different headings. So the first heading is around desirability. So all the assumptions that are around need and what people need and want. The second heading is around feasibility. So that's for our capacity as an organisation to deliver these ideas. So there may be things about our capability or the partners that we work with, some assumptions around those. And then the third thing is viability. So in the long term, has this got legs financially? Is it something that could be sustainable? So map them out, put them under those headings, and that's even if you just do that, that's a really good start point. But then from there you can move on to the second point, which is what order do I test these assumptions in? So the difference between an experiment and a pilot, for instance, is that a pilot will seek to evaluate everything, to evaluate the whole idea, whereas with experiments we're trying to just isolate individual assumptions or variables and do them one by one if we can. So the best place to start is with the desirability stuff, because we need to understand need first, and then we can start to think about our response to it in terms of our capabilities, and then finally we can start to test if there's willingness to pay, or what will this thing cost when we've worked out how we're going to make it. And we can start to test some of the other things. But it is an iterative process. So every time you do an experiment, it might throw up more questions or more assumptions. But I would always suggest starting with the stuff in the desirability category if you can, and move on from there. The third point around what kind of experiment do you use? And this really just depends on the assumption that you're testing. The principle is, the smaller the better, the quicker the better, the cheaper the better. So it could be as simple as, if you're trying to test, maybe you've got a piece of digital content and you want to test which platform people prefer. The best way to do that is just to put the same content in 2 spaces and just check your analytics. You could do a quick poll on social media to ask people, but sometimes what people say they do and what they actually do differ. So if you do use some more kind of traditional survey methods or consultations, it's always good just to test that with a live thing, just to see if people actually do what they say they will do. Sometimes a difference. You could set up, if you want to test the appetite for an online course, you could just set up a blank web page with sign up here for information and just see how many inquiries you get or how many sign-ups you get. So these aren't about putting out a course and seeing what people think. They're just about testing appetite, or kind of testing the kind of small signals, if you like, that we can pick up, and building them as we go. I'm working on a programme now called Real Creative Futures, which is a creative enterprise programme run through the New Art Exchange in Nottingham. We haven't put any product out yet, and we've spent the last month observing. So they've been our tests. We've been observing what some of our partners have been doing, what kind of offers they've been making, how they've been landing. And we have put some very quick tests out through our newsletter, just asking people to choose between A and B. if we could only do one thing, or if we could do one thing out of coaching, training and inspiration sessions, which two would they choose? And that's helped us to understand what people value most, but we'll have to test that with actually putting those things out to see. And then the final point about metrics and deciding how best to evaluate, again, it depends on the assumption. We're probably not going to use the same measures as we use in our business as usual. So it's not necessarily about the volume of people, but we might be trying to understand, did we attract the audience that we expected? So it might just be a small number, but we might be able to validate our assumption through their profile. And I think the important thing here is that it's not about success or failure, it's can we validate or invalidate our assumption. So even if something's invalid, it still gives us some really useful learning that we can take on to the next experiment. So it's all about learning and insight rather than did we get this right or wrong.
I really I really love the kind of bite-sized chunks of thinking, and also looking at an experiment that it breaks it down rather than the point you made around a pilot being like the whole thing. So this helps you kind of condense down. And I really love that you've given us a model for that experimentation.
Yeah, no problem. And I think, again, it's really useful now because we have limited resources. We might have staff furloughed. We've got really limited budgets. So we need to be able to test in the most cost-effective, low-risk way that we can. So this is another reason why this kind of format's really helpful and feels really timely.
Yeah. So to go through the 4 key steps and the format again, you've got be clear about, or get clear about what you're testing. 1.
Yeah.
Figure out what order you're going to do that in. Step 2.
Yeah.
Figure out how you're going to test, like what experiments you're going to do and run. I feel like a scientist.
I know.
And then 4th, figure out how you're going to evaluate that and the learnings that you're going to, like how you're going to look at the learnings.
Exactly. Yeah. And and if you can build a series of experiments in quite quick succession, that's a good practice if you can. It doesn't have to be one every day. It could be putting something out there every week or every other week and just starting to build up the picture from there. And eventually you can arrive at a place where you might be able to run a pilot because you've got enough information and confidence that the idea that you've had has developed and been iterated and is now in a place where it's worthwhile some investment in terms of resources.
Yeah, I love the discovery potential that could be found through that model.
Yeah, absolutely. Because actually we don't have an end goal in mind necessarily. We don't have a fixed idea. So I think it gives us permission to pivot and just to sense our way through, which again, I think in these times feels really important rather than what we're used to doing, which is lots of research and analysis with lots of information, lots of data, but really taking us on a path that we've perhaps already imagined. And this kind of process can help unlock some different thinking and maybe help us imagine some different solutions that we didn't think about in the beginning.
Ellen, thank you so much for sharing you, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much, and happy testing, everyone.
Thank you.